The year was 1918. The world was caught in the final stages of the First World War. Across the ocean, Europe was drowning in fire and smoke, but on American soil, far away from the trenches of France, a different kind of fear was taking shape. It wasn't the sound of artillery or the cry of charging soldiers that haunted the Hudson Valley that year. It was something older, something born not from war, but from legend. The Hudson Valley in New York had long been a place of eerie stories. Thick forests, winding rivers, and patches of heavy mist created the perfect stage for ghost tales. Locals whispered about strange lights in the woods, figures that walked without making a sound, and most famously, the tale of the Headless Horseman. For more than 100 years, the story had spread through the valley. A phantom rider who stalked lonely roads at night, searching for his missing head, doomed to ride until he found it. By 1918, the legend was already famous, thanks to Washington Irving's story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Most people treated it as fiction, just a scary tale for children. But among the soldiers stationed in the Hudson Valley during that time, the story still carried weight. Soldiers on night watch often joked about the horseman to pass the hours. They laughed nervously about who would be unlucky enough to spot him first. Yet beneath the laughter, there was always a sliver of unease, because some men swore the legend wasn't just a story. The soldiers had been sent to the Hudson Valley for training and guard duty. They patrolled lonely stretches of road, watched over supply depots, and guarded quiet farm fields. Many of them were young, fresh recruits waiting to be sent overseas. They weren't expecting danger here at home, but the valley was different at night. It had a silence that pressed down on them, broken only by the distant cry of owls or the rustling of wind through the trees. On some nights, when the mist rolled in from the river, the men admitted the place didn't feel like America at all. It felt older, darker, like stepping into a land where time moved differently. More than one soldier confessed he felt as though unseen eyes were watching him from the shadows. Local townsfolk added to their unease. When the soldiers ventured into the nearby villages, they heard old women warn them not to linger on certain roads after dark. They told the young men never to ignore the sound of hoofbeats in the fog. The soldiers laughed it off. Of course, but privately they wondered, why did the locals seem so serious when they mentioned the horseman? Why did they lock their doors so tightly at night? One evening, as the men sat around a campfire, the subject came up again. A sergeant, older than most of the recruits, leaned in and told them about a story he'd heard from a villager. According to the tale, during the Revolutionary War, a Hessian soldier had been decapitated by a cannonball near the Hudson River. His body was buried, but his head was never found. And ever since, his restless spirit had roamed the valley on horseback, hunting anyone foolish enough to cross his path. The younger soldiers laughed nervously, throwing small stones into the fire. But the sergeant's voice stayed low and serious. He said the villagers believed the horseman wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. They thought he was something worse. Not a lost soul, but a curse tied to the land itself. A figure that appeared in times of unrest or war, feeding on fear. The recruits stopped laughing then, and the fire crackled in uneasy silence. For weeks, nothing unusual happened. The soldiers went about their duties, walking lonely roads at night, standing guard in barns and warehouses, and staring out at the misty hills, but the legend clung to them like a shadow. Every sound in the darkness made them glance over their shoulders. Every faint echo of a horse in the distance made them tighten their grip on their rifles. And then came the night of the encounter. It began quietly, as so many ghost stories do. A group of soldiers had been assigned to a watch post along an old dirt road leading into the valley. The road was lined with thick trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The men stood in the chill air, wrapped in their coats, rifles slung at their sides. At first, they joked with each other to keep the cold away, but after a while, the conversation died down. The mist was rolling in heavier than usual, swallowing the road until only a few feet ahead were visible. One of the men muttered that the place gave him the creeps. Another said he swore he had heard hoofbeats earlier, faint and far away. The others teased him, saying it was just his imagination. But deep down, every man was listening for the same sound. The story of the Headless Horseman wasn't just a campfire tale anymore. It was alive in their minds, pressing down on them in the silence. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to step straight into the legend itself and discover that some stories don't fade with time. Some come back when the world is darkest, when fear is thickest, and when men least expect it. The soldiers of 1918 thought they were safe on American soil. They thought the real battles were across the ocean. But that night in the Hudson Valley, they would come face to face with a nightmare born from their own land, older than the war, older than their country. And once they saw it, they would never be the same again. The night of the encounter started like many others. The soldiers had been assigned to watch the lonely dirt road that cut through the Hudson Valley forest. The road was old, worn down by years of use, and the trees that grew on both sides seemed to bend toward it as if they were hiding something. During the day, it looked like any other country road, quiet and harmless. But at night, when the mist from the river slid over it like a white sheet, the place felt wrong. The men who stood guard there often said it was the worst post in the area. That night, the mist was especially heavy. It clung to the ground and swirled around the soldiers' boots, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Even the moon was hidden, trapped behind thick clouds, so the only light came from the soldiers' lanterns and the small fire they had built at the edge of the road. The fire crackled, throwing weak shadows against the trees, but the shadows only seemed to move strangely, twisting like living things. At first, the men tried to pass the time by talking. One soldier pulled out a small harmonica and played a few notes, but the sound was thin and lonely, swallowed quickly by the fog. Another tried to tell a joke, but no one laughed. The mist had a way of pulling the joy out of everything. After a while, the soldiers grew quiet. They stood with their rifles slung over their shoulders, listening. It was then that one of them, a young private named Henson, suddenly whispered, "Did you hear that?" The others froze. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence so heavy it presses against your ears. Then, faint and far away, came the sound. A rhythmic beat, soft, muffled, but steady. It was the sound of hooves. The soldiers exchanged nervous glances. They knew the sound of horses well. Many farms in the valley still used them, and the army sometimes had patrols on horseback. But this was different. The sound wasn't coming from the direction of the town or the farms. It was coming straight from the forest, deep within the fog. And worse, it was slow, deliberate, almost unnatural. "Probably just a farmer," one of them muttered, though his voice shook. "Or maybe one of ours." But another soldier shook his head. No farmer would be riding out here at this hour. Not in this fog. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. They echoed strangely, as if the trees themselves were carrying the sound. The men tightened their grips on their rifles. The sergeant, a hard man who had seen more than the recruits, whispered for them to stay calm, to hold their ground. But even he kept glancing nervously down the misty road. The fire suddenly seemed too small, too weak to protect them. The mist pressed closer, thick enough to hide anything. The soldiers felt their skin prickle, their breath quicken. Some tried to convince themselves it was just their imagination, that the legend of the horseman had poisoned their minds. But then the lantern light flickered, and the sound of the horse's breathing reached them, heavy, ragged, and too close. A shape began to emerge from the fog. First, the outline of a horse's head, its ears pinned back, steam puffing from its nostrils. The animal was larger than any horse the soldiers had ever seen, its body dark and powerful. Its hooves struck the ground with unnatural weight, the sound echoing like distant thunder. But it wasn't the horse that made the soldiers' blood run cold. It was the rider. Atop the massive animal sat a figure cloaked in black. His shoulders were broad, his posture rigid, but where his head should have been, there was nothing. The cloak rose around an empty space, and the mist seemed to cling to that emptiness, as if afraid to fill it. The soldiers stared in disbelief. The figure's reins were held tightly in gloved hands, but there was no face, no eyes, no voice, only emptiness. The men froze. Every story they had ever heard, every warning from the villagers, every whispered legend slammed into their minds at once. They were staring at the Headless Horseman himself. The sergeant, trying to be brave, shouted for the figure to stop, to identify himself. His voice echoed through the trees, but the rider gave no answer. Instead, the horse snorted and pawed at the ground, its eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. The soldiers swore later that they saw smoke curling from its nostrils, as if the beast had come from the depths of hell itself. The hoofbeats grew louder as the horse stepped forward, each strike shaking the ground beneath the soldier's feet. The rider leaned slightly forward in the saddle, the emptiness where his head should have been staring directly at them. One soldier dropped his rifle and backed away, whispering prayers under his breath. Another raised his weapon, but his hands shook so badly he could barely aim. The firelight flickered again, as though the presence of the rider was draining its strength. The mist thickened, swallowing the trees, and even the stars above. The only things the soldiers could see clearly were the monstrous horse and the terrible figure riding it. The sergeant shouted again, his voice breaking. This time, still no answer. And then, without warning, the horse let out a piercing shriek, not a neigh, but a scream like tearing metal and roaring wind. The soldiers clamped their hands over their ears, but the sound still dug into their bones. The rider raised one arm then, holding what looked like a weapon, but it wasn't a sword, and it wasn't a rifle. In the pale glow of the lantern, the soldiers swore it was a head. A severed head, its mouth frozen in a silent scream, its eyes wide and lifeless. At that sight, panic broke. The soldiers scattered. Some ran down the road, others into the trees. The sergeant shouted for them to hold the line, but his voice was lost in the chaos. The rider spurred his horse forward, the beast charging through the fire, scattering embers into the mist. What happened next was told in fragments because no two soldiers remembered it the same way. Some swore the rider chased them through the woods, his hoofbeats never slowing. Others said he vanished into the fog the moment they broke formation. One soldier claimed he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder, only to find no one there. Another said he heard a voice whisper his name from the mist, even though the horseman had no mouth to speak. When the men finally regrouped, breathless and terrified, the fire had burned low and the road was empty. The mist hung thick as ever, but the hoofbeats were gone. The horseman had vanished, leaving only deep hoofprints in the mud, prints larger than any normal horse could make. The soldiers never spoke of it openly. After that, they gave their reports, but left out the worst details, fearing no one would believe them. Yet among themselves, they knew the truth. They hadn't imagined it. They hadn't dreamed it. The Headless Horseman was real, and they had faced him. The soldiers who had faced the horseman that night never forgot what they saw. In the first few minutes after the encounter, they were too shaken even to speak. They regrouped in small clusters along the muddy road, some with their rifles still clutched tightly in their hands, others empty-handed because they had dropped their weapons in panic. Their faces were pale, and their breathing came in sharp gasps, like men who had just run for miles. The sergeant, still trying to act as if he had control of the situation, barked at them to form up, but his voice cracked in the middle of his orders. The men glanced at him, then at one another, and the truth was plain in their eyes. He was just as terrified as they were. His hands trembled when he reached for his lantern, and when he lifted it high, it only showed the churned-up dirt road littered with hoofprints. The prints were so deep, so wide, that none of them could mistake them for the hooves of an ordinary horse. Maybe it was a trick, one soldier whispered, but even as he said it, he didn't believe it. His voice was hollow, like he was saying the words just to fill the silence. A prank? Maybe someone dressed up, trying to scare us. The others shook their heads. They had all seen the same thing. The towering black horse, the cloaked rider, and that terrible emptiness where his head should have been. One of the younger men, Private Henson, began to sob quietly, covering his face with his hands. He was only 19, barely more than a boy, and the thought of facing such a creature had shattered him. The sergeant finally lowered the lantern and said in a low voice, "We don't speak of this, not to the officers, not to the townsfolk. If anyone asks, it was a wild horse, maybe stolen, nothing more." But even as he said it, none of them could accept that lie. They all knew they had looked into the hollow nothingness where the horseman's face should have been. And once you see something like that, it can't be explained away. The march back to camp was slow and miserable. The mist seemed thicker now, almost as if it were following them, clinging to their uniforms and clouding the path ahead. Every time a twig snapped or an owl hooted in the distance, the men jumped, gripping their rifles tighter. The sound of their own boots squelching in the mud set their nerves on edge. No one dared to walk at the back of the group. Each man tried to stay close to the others, terrified of being left alone where the fog was darkest. When they finally returned to their camp, the other soldiers noticed something was wrong right away. The men who had been on guard looked as if they had aged in a single night. Their eyes were wide and haunted, their uniforms spattered with mud, and their hands shook even when they tried to eat their rations. "What happened out there?" someone asked, but none of them would answer directly. The sergeant repeated his explanation about a stray horse, but the lie was thin. The others could tell by the way the men avoided each other's eyes, by the way their hands trembled when they lifted their tin cups, that something far worse had happened. That night, few of the men managed to sleep. Those who had seen the horsemen kept waking at every sound, imagining the heavy thud of hooves coming closer again. Some swore they could hear whispers in the wind, calling their names, urging them back to the misty road. Private Henson woke screaming twice, shouting about the severed head he swore he had seen in the rider's hands. Each time the others had to shake him awake and remind him that he was safe, though deep down they weren't sure of it themselves. In the days that followed, the story began to spread through the camp, despite the sergeant's warnings. Soldiers talked in hushed tones around the fires, passing along bits and pieces of what had happened. Some added details, that the rider's horse had fiery red eyes, that the severed head had whispered curses, that the fog itself had tried to swallow them whole. The story grew larger and darker with each telling, until men who hadn't even been there claimed they could feel the horseman's presence whenever the mist rolled in. The officers eventually caught wind of the rumors, and they weren't pleased. They lectured the men about discipline and warned them against superstition, but their words had no power against the fear already planted in the soldiers' hearts. Men began refusing to take guard duty near the Hudson Road. They claimed their rifles jammed more often there, that the air grew too cold to breathe, that the lanterns flickered for no reason. Even the bravest among them admitted the place felt wrong. One evening, a group of soldiers set out to test the story. They weren't there on official duty. They had been drinking, and their courage came from the bottom of a whiskey bottle. They mocked the others for being cowards, and swore they would prove the horseman was nothing but a tale. With laughter on their lips and rifles in hand, they marched into the fog. Hours later, they stumbled back into camp. Their laughter was gone. Their faces were ashen, their eyes wild. They refused to speak about what they had seen, but one man's hair had turned white at the temples overnight. Another trembled so badly he couldn't reload his weapon for days. After that, no one dared to challenge the story again. The fear of the Headless Horseman lingered in the camp for the rest of the war. Soldiers wrote letters home about strange feelings, about shadows that moved in the mist, about hoofbeats that echoed long after the road was empty. Some of those letters were destroyed by officers who wanted to keep morale strong, but others survived, hidden in family trunks and passed down through generations. For the men who had been there that night in 1918, the encounter changed them forever. Some refused to talk about it, locking the memory deep inside where it would never see the light. Others became obsessed, searching old libraries and town records for any mention of the horseman, desperate to understand what they had faced. But the truth was, there was no understanding it. The Hudson Valley had always been a place of shadows, a place where old stories and restless spirits lingered. And on that misty road in 1918, the soldiers had learned the truth the hard way. The legend of the Headless Horseman wasn't just a story to frighten children, it was real. And once you see him, once you hear those hoofbeats pounding in the fog, you never escape the memory. It follows you, haunting every step, whispering in every shadow. The weeks after the first encounter were some of the longest of the soldiers' lives. Even though the officers tried to brush the event aside, even though the sergeant ordered the men to stay silent, fear had already taken root. It wasn't something that could be erased with orders. Every night, when the fog rolled thick across the Hudson Valley, the men remembered what they had seen, the black horse, the cloaked rider, and that awful emptiness where a head should have been. At first, the soldiers did everything they could to avoid being placed on night watch near the misty road. They traded duties with others, offered up cigarettes, rations, and favors just to stay away from that cursed stretch of land. The officers noticed and grew frustrated, but they couldn't stop the fear from spreading. The men whispered about the horsemen in their tents, around the fire, and even in letters home, though some never dared write his name, only hinting at the rider we saw or the one who comes with the fog. One night, about 3 weeks after the first sighting, it happened again. A group of 4 soldiers had been sent to guard the eastern path, a narrow dirt road that curved through the trees. The fog that night was thick enough to swallow the lantern light, and the men had to huddle close together just to see one another's faces. For a while, it was quiet. The only sounds were the creak of their gear and the distant calls of owls. But then, faintly at first, they heard it. The sound that made their blood run cold. Hoofbeats. Slow, heavy, steady. The men froze, their eyes darting to one another in the pale glow of the lantern. One of them, Corporal Evans, whispered, "Not again." His voice trembled so badly that the words were barely audible. The others raised their rifles, but their hands shook. They remembered what had happened before. Bullets meant nothing. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing through the trees like thunder. The ground itself seemed to vibrate beneath their boots. Then from the fog, a shadow began to form. At first it was just a shape, tall and broad, mounted on something massive. But the closer it came, the clearer it became, until they saw it for what it was. The rider, cloak whipping in the wind, black horse snorting clouds of mist, and that same horrifying absence where a head should be. The men's courage broke. One fired wildly into the fog, the shots ringing out sharp and desperate. But just as before, the bullets did nothing. They passed straight through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The horseman rode closer, and one of the soldiers swore later that he saw the rider raise an arm, pointing directly at him. The gesture was slow, deliberate, almost like a curse. The soldier screamed and bolted into the trees, abandoning his post. The others followed, stumbling through branches, their lantern crashing to the ground and snuffing out in the mud. By dawn, the men had made their way back to camp, shaken, filthy, and bleeding from scratches and falls. They told the same story the first group had told. The horseman had returned, his hoofbeats echoing in the fog, his presence too real to be denied. This second sighting was harder for the officers to cover up. Too many men had seen it now, and the whispers grew louder. Some soldiers refused to leave camp after dark, claiming they would rather face court-martial than the horseman. Others carried charms, Bible verses tucked into their pockets, or even locks of hair from loved ones back home, as if anything might ward off the spirit. The fear began to change the camp itself. Discipline broke down in subtle ways. Men jumped at shadows. Lanterns were kept burning longer at night, wasting precious fuel because no one dared sit in darkness. Even during the day, when the mist clung to the trees, the soldiers grew restless, eyes darting constantly as though expecting the rider to come charging through at any moment. But the most chilling part came from the stories of pursuit. Several men swore the horseman wasn't just appearing and disappearing anymore. He was chasing them. One soldier, Private Willis, told of running through the woods with the pounding of hooves behind him, always just a few steps away. He said he could feel the ground shake beneath each strike, hear the ragged snort of the black horse in his ear. And though he ran until his lungs burned, he claimed the sound never faded. He wasn't the only one. Another group, caught out near the road during heavy fog, swore they had heard the horse circle them, unseen in the mist. The hoofbeats going around and around until they thought they would lose their minds. Then, just as suddenly, silence, as if the rider had vanished into thin air. The soldiers began to believe something terrifying. The horseman wasn't just appearing by chance, he was watching them, choosing his moments, hunting them like prey. The fog wasn't just weather anymore, it was a warning. And whenever it rolled in thick and heavy, men whispered prayers and clutched their rifles tighter, though they knew the weapons were useless. One night, a sentry was found unconscious near the road. When he woke, his face was pale and his eyes wild. He claimed the horseman had ridden straight up to him and leaned low in the saddle, close enough that he felt the icy air where the head should have been. He passed out before he could see what happened next. That was when even the officers stopped dismissing the stories. They didn't speak of it openly. But their orders changed. Patrols near the misty road were doubled. Lanterns were ordered to stay lit all night, and guards were rotated more frequently, as if they believed shorter shifts might reduce the chance of an encounter. But no matter what they did, the sightings didn't stop. Some nights the horsemen never appeared and the men dared to breathe easy. But other nights, when the fog rose thick and the moon was hidden, the sound of hoofbeats came again, steady and relentless, echoing across the Hudson Valley like a drumbeat of doom. And each time he appeared, the soldiers felt the same thing. Not just fear, but the chilling sense that the horseman was claiming the land, that they had stumbled into a place where no living men were welcome. The legend that had haunted the Hudson Valley for centuries had returned, and now it was no longer a story told to frighten children. It was real, it was relentless, and it had chosen them. The longer the soldiers stayed in the Hudson Valley, the worse their fear grew. At first, the horseman had appeared only in the mist, a distant figure whose hoofbeats came and went like echoes. But by the time winter's chill settled over the camp, the soldiers realized something dreadful. The horseman was no longer just haunting the edges of their patrols. He was drawing closer, testing them, pushing deeper into their nights. It happened one night just before dawn, when the camp was quiet and most of the men were asleep in their tents. The fog rolled in thicker than anyone had ever seen before, a pale blanket that swallowed the campfires and reduced the world to only a few feet of sight. The sentries on duty fidgeted nervously, their lanterns flickering as if struggling to stay alive in the heavy mist. Then came the sound. Hoofbeats. They weren't distant this time. They weren't faint or muffled by the woods. They were inside the camp. The steady pounding rhythm shook the earth under the soldiers' boots, rattled the tin cups hanging by their tents, and echoed inside their chests. The guards shouted in alarm, their voices breaking with fear, and within seconds the entire camp was awake, stumbling from their tents with rifles in hand. What they saw chilled their blood. Through the swirling fog, the outline of a massive horse emerged, black as midnight. The soldiers raised their weapons, but they hesitated when the rider came into view. There he was, unmistakable, cloaked in shadow, towering in the saddle, the place where his head should have been nothing but emptiness. And yet, despite the lack of a face, the men swore they felt him staring straight at them. For a long, terrifying moment, the rider sat motionless in the center of camp. His horse's breath steamed in the cold air, glowing faintly in the lantern light. The silence was broken only by the terrified gasps of the men and the crackle of the dying campfire. Then, without warning, the horseman raised an arm. Some soldiers swore he held a weapon, an axe, gleaming faintly in the mist. Others claimed his hand was empty, but the gesture was enough. It was a signal, a challenge, maybe even a curse. Whatever it meant, it shattered what little courage the men had left. A volley of gunfire rang out. Rifles blazed, muzzles flashing through the fog as the soldiers poured everything they had into the figure. Bullets whistled through the air, but just as before, they passed straight through the rider. The shots tore into the trees beyond, splintering branches and echoing into the night. But the horseman didn't flinch. Not once. His horse reared high, hooves striking the air, and the sound was deafening. Men fell back in panic, some tripping over tents, others dropping their rifles in terror. The rider seemed to loom larger with each second, the mist swirling around him as though it obeyed his will. Then came the charge. The horseman spurred his horse forward, thundering through the heart of the camp. Soldiers screamed as they scattered in every direction. Some dove into the mud. Others tried to hide behind wagons, but the black horse barreled through, its hooves striking so close that men swore they felt the ground split beneath them. The figure passed through tents as if they were smoke, ripping them apart without touching them, scattering canvas and poles like leaves in a storm. Private Henson, the youngest of the group, was nearly trampled. He later said the horse passed right through him, not over him, but through him, and he felt a cold so deep it was as if ice water had filled his veins. He collapsed in the mud, shivering violently, and had to be dragged to safety by two of his comrades. The camp was chaos. Men shouted orders that no one obeyed, rifles fired blindly into the fog, and the sound of hoofbeats echoed endlessly as the horsemen circled them. Some men swore he laughed, a low, hollow sound that rattled their bones, though others claimed it was just the wind. Either way, the noise drove many to the brink of madness. The officers tried desperately to restore order, but even they could not stand against the sight of the rider. One lieutenant stood his ground, firing his revolver again and again into the figure. But when the horseman passed by, the man fell to his knees, his eyes wide with terror, his weapon slipping from his hand. Later, he could not explain what had happened, only that when the rider turned toward him, he felt as if his very soul was being torn from his body. By the time the first light of dawn began to pierce the fog, the horseman was gone. The hoofbeats faded, the mist began to thin, and the camp lay in ruins. Tents were shredded, supplies scattered, and the men themselves were broken. Some were injured from falling or colliding with each other in the chaos, but the true wounds were deeper. They had faced something they could not fight, could not stop, and could not understand. When the officers finally gathered the men to take account of the night, many refused to speak. They sat trembling, their eyes fixed on the ground, as if afraid that saying the words out loud might bring the rider back. A few muttered prayers under their breath, clutching crosses or small tokens from home. The lieutenant who had faced the horseman directly was never the same again. His hair turned noticeably whiter in the weeks that followed, and his once steady hands shook so badly he could barely write reports. Eventually, he was relieved of his command and sent home, his mind broken by something no military training could prepare him for. From that night onward, the entire camp lived under a shadow. Every foggy evening brought dread. Every distant sound of hooves made the men grip their rifles tighter, though they knew it would do no good. The legend of the Headless Horseman was no longer just a story passed down through generations. It was now their reality. And the worst part was the growing belief among the soldiers. The horseman wasn't just haunting the valley, he had chosen them. He had marked their camp as his hunting ground, and as long as they remained there, he would come again. After the attack on the camp, the men could no longer sleep soundly. Every shadow looked like a rider. Every rustle in the trees made them jump, and every misty night filled them with dread. But fear alone could not keep soldiers in place forever. By the third night, after the horsemen had stormed through their camp, their commanding officers made a decision. They would move the unit out of the valley before it destroyed them completely. The official order said they were redeploying for better terrain, but every soldier knew the truth. They were running from him. At dusk, the men packed what supplies they could salvage. Many left behind equipment, weapons, even personal belongings. Nothing mattered except leaving before darkness swallowed the valley again. They moved in tight formation, their boots crunching on frosted leaves as they pushed deeper into the thick woods. At first, the march was silent, except for the sound of footsteps and the occasional nervous cough. The fog was lighter than usual, and some dared to hope they would escape without incident. But as the sun bled away behind the hills, that hope withered. The fog returned. It poured down from the treetops like a living thing, curling around their ankles, rising to their knees, then higher. The moon disappeared behind thick clouds, leaving the forest bathed in shifting gray. Men muttered prayers. Others gripped their rifles so tightly their knuckles turned white. And then it came. The sound, hoofbeats. At first, distant, faint, almost like the beat of a drum echoing through the trees. But each second brought them closer, louder, sharper. The soldiers froze, every man listening, their breath clouding in the cold air. The officers barked orders to keep moving, to stay calm. But no command could silence the terror in their hearts. The hoofbeats were gaining. Through the fog ahead, a shadow moved between the trees. Massive, mounted. The black horse emerged with terrifying speed, its rider hunched forward, cloak flaring behind him. No head sat on his shoulders, yet every soldier swore they felt his eyeless gaze. Panic exploded through the ranks. "Run!" someone screamed, and the order rippled like wildfire. Formation collapsed. Men scattered in every direction, tripping over roots and colliding with one another as they plunged deeper into the forest. Rifles were dropped, packs abandoned. Survival was the only thought. The horseman gave chase. The sound of his horse crashing through the woods was deafening. Branches snapping, hooves pounding, leaves scattering. And yet, impossibly, the rider never seemed slowed by the terrain. He moved as if the forest bent out of his way, clearing a path for the hunt. Private Miller swore he saw the horseman pass straight through a massive oak tree without breaking stride, his horse glowing faintly as if wrapped in a pale fire. Miller ran until his lungs burned, but the hoofbeats always stayed just behind him, no matter how fast he fled. Groups of soldiers tried to stick together, but the fog tore them apart. One moment, you were running side by side with your comrades, and the next, you were alone, stumbling through darkness, the pounding hooves circling closer. Private Dawson tripped on a root and fell hard. He looked up just in time to see the horseman bearing down on him. The rider swung his arm, and Dawson swore he saw a massive axe gleaming. He screamed, and then silence. When the others found the spot later, Dawson was gone. No blood, no body. Just his rifle lying abandoned in the dirt. For others, the chase was worse than death. Sergeant Keller kept shouting orders to regroup, to stand and fight, but the men ignored him. When he finally stopped running and aimed his rifle into the fog, he fired until his weapon clicked empty. Moments later, men heard his strangled cry echo through the trees. Then nothing. His voice never returned. The horseman did not strike all at once. He toyed with them. He would appear in front of one group, forcing them to scatter, then vanish into the mist, only to reappear behind another. The chase lasted hours, though the men swore it felt like days. Time stretched under the weight of terror. Some soldiers ran until they collapsed, their legs giving out beneath them. They lay in the leaves too exhausted to move, waiting for the rider's cold touch. But sometimes he passed them by, sparing them, or perhaps saving them for later. One of the most haunting moments came when Corporal Hughes, stumbling through the dark, heard laughter, hollow, echoing, inhuman. It followed him, circling, weaving through the trees. He later told others it was not the laughter of a man, but of something that mocked humanity itself. He dropped his weapon and clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound still seeped into his skull. By morning, Hughes had gone mad. The soldiers who survived the night described the chase as endless. The horseman seemed everywhere at once, no matter which way they turned. His horse's eyes glowed faintly in the mist, like twin lanterns hunting them through the woods. His weapon, sometimes an axe, sometimes a sword, sometimes nothing at all, gleamed faintly when he raised it. And always, the pounding hooves. They never stopped. Only when the first faint light of dawn touched the treetops did the pursuit finally end. The hoofbeats faded into silence. The fog lifted slightly, and the soldiers, what remained of them, stumbled into a clearing. There, they regrouped, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. Of the dozens who had marched out of camp the night before, many were missing. Some were never seen again. Others were found later, wandering the woods in shock, unable to speak. The survivors swore one thing above all: the horseman could not be outrun. No matter how far they ran, no matter how fast, he was always just behind them, always there, always hunting. From that night on, the soldiers knew escape was impossible. The Hudson Valley belonged to him. When dawn finally came, the surviving soldiers stood in silence. Their uniforms were torn, their boots caked with mud, their faces pale as if they had aged years overnight. They looked at one another, and in their eyes was the same thing: emptiness. Fear had hollowed them out. The officers tried to keep order. They counted heads, gave quick orders, tried to act like everything was still under control, but it wasn't. The men all knew it. Too many were gone, simply vanished into the fog. Some who had been strong the day before were now broken shells, trembling, whispering nonsense, staring at things no one else could see. The soldiers were eventually marched out of the woods. They walked like ghosts, dragging their feet, looking back over their shoulders every few minutes, as if expecting the horsemen to charge out of the morning mist. The valley lay behind them, but the fear never left. When they finally reached safety, the official reports were written up. The army could not and would not tell the truth. The documents described heavy fog conditions, soldiers lost during night maneuvers, and psychological strain due to wartime pressures. On paper, the events became nothing more than a training accident. But the men who lived through it knew better. Some refused to ever speak about that night again. They locked it deep inside themselves, hoping silence would keep the horsemen from following them. Others tried to tell the truth, but who would believe them? A headless rider, chasing a company of U.S. soldiers through the woods in 1918. It sounded like a ghost story, not an official military record. Yet stories began to spread anyway. Soldiers told their families pieces of what happened. Old men years later, sitting on porches, would mutter about the rider in the fog, and sometimes, in the towns near the Hudson Valley, strange rumors started to surface. Hikers spoke of hearing hoofbeats deep in the woods, though no horses were nearby. Farmers swore they saw a rider moving across the tree line at night, tall, cloaked, and headless. Some even claimed their livestock panicked at unseen dangers whenever the fog grew thick. The valley itself gained a reputation. Locals whispered warnings. Don't go near the woods after dark. Don't follow the fog. If you hear hooves, run the other way. Parents told their children these things as bedtime rules, but the children grew up believing them. The legend of the horseman, already old, had been given new life by the soldier's tale. For the survivors, the nightmare never ended. Private Miller, who had sworn he saw the rider pass through a tree, was never the same. He woke screaming many nights, hearing phantom hoofbeats pounding in his dreams. Corporal Hughes, the one who heard the laughter, was committed to a hospital and never regained his sanity. The few who lived long lives carried the memory quietly, but their letters, their journals, found years later, revealed the truth they couldn't say aloud. One chilling entry from a veteran, written decades after the war, read, "We thought we were soldiers. We thought rifles and bayonets could save us. But that night, under the fog, we were just prey, and he hunted us. The horseman does not die. He does not rest. He waits and he rides again." Over time, the 1918 encounter faded from public memory. But in the Hudson Valley itself, the story still lingers. Some say if you walk there on a cold autumn night, when the fog is thick and the moon is hidden, you can still hear the distant echo of hooves. Others claim the horseman still rides at dawn, vanishing with the first light of day, searching endlessly for something, maybe revenge, maybe his lost head, maybe simply souls to terrify. And so the legend endures. The soldiers who lived through it left the valley behind, but the horseman never left them. His presence haunted their nights, their dreams, their final years. And for those who vanished into the fog, their names were never truly forgotten. Instead, they became part of the story, part of the curse of the valley, part of the eternal hunt. The Headless Horseman was not just a tale for children, not just a fireside ghost story. For those men in 1918, he was real, and the truth they carried to their graves was simple and terrifying. Asterisk, the Headless Rider still rides, and once you've heard his hooves, you never escape him.